When I recorded my video, Easy Ways to Be Your Own GM, I had no idea that it would become so popular and indeed almost dictate the direction that the Geek Gamers channel took thereafter because there was so much interest in the concepts I was putting forward about how you could work with RPG rule sets on your own without a GM, or maybe even cooperatively with friends without a GM. And I think what really caught people's attention with that video is that I was putting forward general concepts and ideas about ways to do this that were translatable across rule sets and without buying tons of different supplements and without relying on tons of different oracle tables and things like that, which I do find useful but can also be a little bit distracting and or lead to dead ends, as I talk about in the book that I ended up writing, the Solo GM Guide. We're looking here at the table of contents of the book, and I just want to give you a little bit more of a sense of what is in the book. It's available for pre-order now, and I hope that this video will provide a little bit more information than has been out there so far about what the book actually is and how you can use it. I divided the book into 3 parts, and the first part is talking about, I call it campaign level. It's the big picture about what solo RPGing really is and how to attain a mindset of a solo GM. And I think this is important because it is very different to sit down with a rule set that you're going to solo than it is to sitting down with a bunch of friends, either virtually or around an actual table, to play an RPG rule set. And I talk about the 10 mindsets of a solo GM and how having these mindsets can really positively impact your play and what the level of enjoyment that you get out of it. So for example, in this chapter opener, we're looking here at the chapter opener, Think Like a Solo GM. I list the 10 mindsets here, and then I go through and I explain them all in the chapter, and I give examples of them. And I think that bearing these things in mind when you are playing solo will really increase your enjoyment of the experience a great deal. And I try to walk you through some examples. So for example, here, mindset number 7, you can see I say stats are not story, numbers are not narrative, and I explain exactly what this means in terms of soloing a rule set. And I ask you to consider a list of numbers and how that is not narratively based, and then adding in the concept that the numbers are attached to perhaps attributes like wisdom, dexterity, or strength. And you can see that for an experienced player, maybe some character formation is coming to mind with that. And then I consider having you consider adding in some description or words and beginning to put together a sentence about what with those words, and ask you to think about the degree to which that is connected to a story until we get to the end here on this page at any rate, where we have the description of a warrior who is bloodied and exhausted approaching a dungeon under a mage tower, which is guarded by an orc who is holding a wizard prisoner. And then on the next page, we continue to develop this, and I show how the use of selective adjectives can create a connection and a relationship among the characters, and how that in and of itself becomes the key to opening up something as a story, and pointing out that story is ultimately created from emotion and not stats. So this is just one example of walking you through that concept and how having that concept in mind and keeping that concept in mind when you are soloing rule sets can help you develop your sessions into something pretty exciting. The second part of the book is called At the Table, and it really focuses on rules and how to use them. And I start by talking about how you can start a solo session with no rules. And I've demonstrated this on my channel, and I think it's really important to understand that this is possible to do, because starting without a rule set really does force you to start with story. And I give an example here with some tables, because of course there's tons of tables in this book of how you can give a complete random beginning to something and then choose a rule set for it. So you could, for example, roll on this D6 table of environment here, and let's say you rolled a 2, then you would go to, you'd be doing something urban, and then you'd roll on this D10, and perhaps you would get a late night diner, for example, if you rolled an 8. And you would automatically have a place. And then I provide tables for what I call adjectives of disconnection and adjectives of connection, and using these in conjunction with a place or maybe even two places that you've rolled up to then begin to make an environment that is dynamic and that automatically has some story built into it. So if you've got that late night diner that, say, for example, is claustrophobic or is secluded in some way, and then you rolled up another urban environment to look back at this table, say the abandoned warehouse. So for example, you have that late night diner, and then let's say you roll up this apartment complex, and the apartment complex is very inviting. So you have an inviting apartment complex, and you have a deserted or isolated late night diner as the beginnings of your environment. That automatically starts to provide you with an environment that could have many different stories attached to it. Perhaps your hero is somebody who is happily ensconced in their apartment and receives a call to the diner from someone he owes a favor to, and that is the beginning of his foray into the underworld of this city in a kind of dangerous way. Or perhaps it is even in reverse, that you are starting out with a character who is in this late night diner at a respite, escaping somebody who has been chasing him, and he sees through the diner window, he realizes he's in a place that he used to know. That's an apartment complex that his best friend used to live in, and the beginning of your session is him making his way there to try to get help. Whatever the case is, you are putting your characters into an environment that already exists. And so the suggestion here, as a way of starting without rules, is to start with an environment with 3 things in it that will give you a solid foundation. And I go on to talk about ways to start a session that don't have anything to do with character creation. And we just talked about an environment here. That was point 1, but I list 10 things here that you could either roll on and try to do, or select which made sense to you, like making up an NPC and having them tell a story. And then based on that story, maybe something will stand out to you, and that will be your character. Or, as I've shown often on the channel, rolling on a trinket table and describing the trinket and the history of the trinket, and maybe something from there will create a basis for a session for you. But this section, of course, also talks about if you want to start with a rule set, and I go through ways based on a couple of popular rule sets like Scarlet Heroes and Index Card RPG, how you could actually start with a specific rule set. And though I use those two as specific examples, these principles, as with almost everything in this book, can be generalized to any rule set. And then I talk about really big rule sets because, of course, many rule sets are huge with multiple hundreds of, maybe even thousands of pages of books and material. And I give some really very basic step-by-step ways to get into really big rule sets as a soloist so you don't get overwhelmed. And the first thing I mention, and I've mentioned this on the channel as well, is to skip over character creation. And elsewhere in the Solo GM Guide, I talk about the reasons for doing that. I talk about looking for anomalies in the rule set, and I walk through examples here in this chapter using Starfinder and some other big rule sets to demonstrate what I mean by looking for anomalies in a rule set and latching onto that, and letting the seed of a big idea come out of the specifics of what you read. And I talk in this chapter, I give some detailed discussion of how to do this with the popular 2D20 mechanics, which are in Mutant Chronicles and Robert E. Howard's Conan and John Carter of Mars and Dune, that are very dynamic and narrative based. And I walk you through step by step approaching these rules using the reference of the new Cthulhu 2D20 rule set that shows specifically how to get a session going when you're faced with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of source material and not getting overwhelmed by doing that. And then finally, in this section on rules, of course, I need to do a single chapter just devoted to D&D, because D&D, as I talk about, is both the same and different as every other rule set. And I talk about the reasons why it's the same and different and how to apply the principles of the Solo GM guide to D&D in particular, so that you have a specific reference to using D&D. And I give an extended example of this based on the D&D Essentials kit of how I do it, what my idea was, where it came from, and what I would do next, so that if you want to approach either the D&D Essentials kit or any D&D rulebook, you would have a step-by-step way of doing it based on the principles that I put forth in the Solo GM guide. Then part 3 of the book goes into what I call tools of the trade. This is a discussion of oracles, dice, and random tables, because, of course, every soloist is using these types of tools. And the first thing I talk about here is the reasons why I think sometimes turning to a random table can end up in a dead-end situation. If you are asking too many questions of a random table, for example, you can be unsuccessful in getting anything but a yes or a no, and then just getting to what I call a narrative dead end. And I talk about the reasons why this happens and really what to do to avoid this happening, and how to ascertain whether when you're rolling the dice, it's a good idea or a bad idea to do it. And when I say good idea or bad idea, I mean narratively speaking. I also give some tips on making your own random tables and making random tables that will be generative and will be helping you move your story along. Because the main message of this book is that what makes a successful solo RPG session is always wanting to know what happens next. And this is what happens in my videos, that as people watch my videos, they want to know what happens next. And when people write to the channel, they say to me, how do I do sessions like you do sessions, where I always want to know what happens next? And it feels like something is surprising and something is unfolding. That's what you want as the soloist. And knowing how and when to roll on random tables is really key to that. The other key to that is understanding what narrative trajectory means. And I have a whole chapter devoted to this, because it's important to understand what a narrative path is, what story progression means, and how to get it and how to keep it in your own solo sessions. And I have a whole discussion here of that with, again, tons of examples of how to make this happen for your own solo sessions. And then finally, the book ends with 70 pages or so of appendices, which are random tables and checklists in terms of there's a solo session checklist and guide to starting out. I have a discussion of my solo RPG wallet, and that is something that you see often on the Geek Gamers channel. I talk about what is in it. I provide you with some of the actual tables that I use, the ones that I could get permission to reprint, and the ones that I couldn't, I tell you what they are. I have some random tables here on attitudes for heroes or NPCs and tables of connection and disconnection. We looked at that a little bit before. These are tables that should really enable you to get started in a way that privileges storytelling and narrative development. I also have an appendix that has some quick tables for starting with no rule set, as we talked about, and will get you going in creating an environment with a few things in it that are related to each other and that maybe have some kind of feeling about them. Because if you have something concrete and something with a feeling, and you have more than one of those things, you can start to create a story out of that. There is a brief table discussion. Want to adjust some monster NPC stats and give yourself what I would characterize as an easier encounter or a medium encounter or a really challenging and hard encounter. I have some recommendations for how to adjust stats and to mitigate combat and encounter difficulty. There is a literary random table in this book. The literary random table, you may have seen me in the Geek Gamers channel sessions rolling on Victorian novels to come up with little story ideas or little descriptions of scenes. And you may have thought to yourself, I would love to do that, but I haven't read those novels, or I don't own those novels, or I'm not sure which ones to get. Well, I have a literary random table here that is full of, it's a D66 table that is full of atmospheric or gothic kinds of entries from classic literature. There are some of the entries are long, some of the entries are short, but you will be able to roll on these entries and come up with things that you can use as memories of characters or atmospheres of places that your characters are in, or maybe even just a story seed for your entire session. I also talk about, I give some specific recommendations of rule sets that soloists may wish to use, including whether or not there is a best one for starting. And I try to give a range of recommendations here with a brief description of rule sets that will offer what I think are the pluses and minuses of starting out with them. And then I offer what I consider to be some essential random tables, including my favorite basic percentile table and general oracles from some classic rule sets that are quite useful. There are action oracles and theme oracles and plot twists that you can use. So if you are someone who wants to use a lot of oracles and tables, they're all gathered together here in just the one book. And then finally, what would a book about role-playing be without its own appendix? And this is my own annotated inspirational and educational reading list. And I've broken it down into books about writing and books about places and spaces, and then books about gaming and specifically solo gaming. Because reading all of these materials have helped me to formulate my ideas and my strategies and skills for soloing and to get even further in depth than my own solo GM guide offers. I recommend all of these. And finally, as an addenda to the book, I have included an essay I've written called A Place Underground, or Dungeon Theory for All. This is a thought piece on the psychological and emotional purposes that dungeons serve in role-playing games. It does offer supporting explanations of why dungeons nurture emotional connections and the significance of that. And it may explain why doing dungeon crawling in RPGs is so popular, and may even encourage you, if you are just starting out on a solo RPG journey, to start out by having your characters do a classic dungeon crawl. So that's a little bit more of an in-depth look inside the Solo GM guide. As I said, it is available for pre-order now. I have links to the Modifius US-based store and the UK-based store. When the book is actually published in a few months, it will also be available for sale on Amazon, but it is not available for pre-order on Amazon. So I would really encourage you to put in your pre-orders for Modifius. I would appreciate the support, and thank you as always for watching.